Now, as we've been studying in the book of Genesis, Tasha and I were talking this morning. It's funny, we don't always think about this because we're very far removed from that. And we've seen a lot. We have the scriptures. We have the life stories of the people from the scriptures to remind us of what God is doing. But we're talking about Genesis here. You got to remember that this is all brand new to these people. I mean, when Abraham hears from God that you're to leave your land and go to this other land that I'm not even going to tell you what that other land is, just kind of start wandering and I'll point it out to you. This is not something he has a history to go on. He can go back and say, wow, I've seen God faithful in the past, so he's going to be faithful now. No, this is all new. And so we're talking about creation and then the fall of man and how sin spread. And then God began through Abraham to build this nation that's going to bring blessing to the whole world. And then today we're going to be talking about Abraham's son, Isaac. Now, we don't talk a whole lot about Isaac. It's funny, the scripture passages, the lives of these guys intersect a good bit. And it seems like we tend to most of the time jump from Abraham to Jacob. You know, Isaac is kind of stuck in the middle there, and we talk about him a little bit when we talk about Genesis 22 and the offering that Abraham offered up with Isaac, but we don't really talk about Isaac a whole lot. Now, one thing I want us to understand as we look at these people's lives is the thing that points out, one of the things that points out to us that the truth of the scriptures is that the scriptures never present any of these people as perfect. Jesus is the only one that's perfect, and it has to present Jesus as perfect because he is. It doesn't that we don't present Jesus as perfect so that we'll believe in him. We present him as perfect because he is perfect. But the scriptures show us these people who are icons for us to, icons I guess wouldn't be the right word, but people for us to follow, to seek to emulate their lives many times. And they have warts and all. We see all kinds of craziness. And as I was thinking about that and thinking about this morning's passage, I want us to think about 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Now, in 1 Corinthians 10, what Paul is talking about there in this passage, that these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction. Now, in that passage, contextually, he's talking about the nation of Israel. He's not talking about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. He's talking about all the struggles that the nation of Israel had in the wilderness. But we can still take the passage and look back and say these people's lives are an example for us. An example of good, an example of bad. An example to follow, an example to say, I don't want to do that. And in that passage in 1 Corinthians 10, the reason Paul says this is an example is he gives two reasons. One, he says in verse 12, this is verse 11. Verse 12, he says it's basically so you don't get too cocky. He says, he who thinks he stands, take heed lest he fall. He says, look at all these examples. And you can look back and you go, man, I can't believe that Isaac blew it like that. I can't believe that Jacob blew it like that. And Paul's going, just remember, they're written down as examples for us so that when we think we stand, take heed lest we fall. But it's also a positive example of God will carry you through because verse 13 says, no temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. And God is faithful who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape. He says, you look back to these guys and it says, look, remember, they were chosen by God. Not because they were special, not because there was anything good in them, but that because God had a purpose for their life. So you don't get cocky. God has a purpose for your life. He's chosen you. Don't think it's all about how wonderful you are. But also remember that when those times come and you feel like I'm not going to make it, God will carry you through just like he did these people in the Old Testament. So as we're looking at these people's lives, we need to remember this, that they're written down for our instruction. Now, Genesis 22 that Brian talked about last week, most of the time we talk about that because it focuses mostly on Abraham. Abraham has been called to take his son, Isaac, the chosen son, and take him up and sacrifice him. And immediately Abraham obeys, and he begins to walk to this mountain that God's going to show him to sacrifice his son. But I want to see, what does this have to tell us about Isaac also? And I think verses 11 and 12 really kind of stand out for us to understand what Isaac learns from here. Because this is, when you get to verses 11 and 12, Isaac is now tied up and on the altar. And God says this to Abraham. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Now, a couple of things about verse 12. Several years ago, it became even more popular than it was before, but there was this popular idea called open theology. Now, this is deep stuff here, so just, put on your boots and let's go for it. But open theology basically said that God learns things. That's just kind of to sum it up. That God's sitting around and he goes, oh, wow, I didn't expect that. Oh, man, this is something new. I'm learning something new every day. And so it seems like verse 12 is saying that. God says, now I know that you fear God. Now, it's not that God's learning something. It's that God is experiencing with Abraham's trust in him. He has called Abraham. He's promised things to Abraham. He's seen Abraham obey. But now he's seeing Abraham is serious about this. He's experiencing it with him. But what does he say that he experiences with him? I understand and now I know that you fear the Lord. Now, when we talk about fearing the Lord, we don't like to talk about that a whole lot. We talk about fear thinking of horror movies we've seen and things jumping out and grabbing us, and we think of fear that way. We think of snakes and spiders or whatever else makes us afraid. But the fear of God is this idea of understanding and knowing and having awe in who He is and trusting Him with everything. God's saying, Abraham, you trusted me to move. You trusted me in other areas, but now you're trusting me with the promise that I've told you this is going to be the child, that through this child there will be a great nation. Through this child, every nation on the earth will be blessed. And when I said take this child and sacrifice, you trusted me enough to know that even if you have to kill Isaac, he will come back from the dead. You say, wait, how do you know that? Read Hebrews 11. It says Abraham trusted enough to know that God was going to bring Isaac back if he killed him. We see it in Genesis 12 because Abraham tells the servants, the boy and I are going to go make a sacrifice and we will return to you. We will return to you? Now, I did think, well, was Abraham just stupid? Did he think, what was he thinking here? Well, let's look at Isaac. Sunday school taught us the wrong things about Isaac. Because you used to have when I was younger, we had flannel graph and you had Abraham, and Abraham was 100 years old and Isaac was 3 and he was carrying the wood up on the mountain. He's this little baby and he's just going along with dad. No. If Genesis 23 happens right after this, Isaac's about 27 years old. Maybe that's pushing it a little bit, but he's at least a teenager. He's old enough, he's carrying the wood. He's old enough to reason, hey, there's not a lamb. Something's not right here. We got fire, we got the wood, where's the sacrifice? So he's old enough to understand this, and he's old enough to see that once he has submitted to his father and allowed his father to tie him down to an altar, he has seen God provide. And he's seen God provide to the point where now God is saying, Abraham, now I know that you fear me. I'm sorry, I got off the rug. I've got to stay on the rug. Somebody come nail my shoe down. We're seeing this where he sees that God says, you now fear me. But one thing I want us to look at just real quickly, and this has nothing to do with today's message, but it has a lot to do with today's message. In verse 8 of chapter 22, when Isaac says, hey, look, we've got the wood, we've got the fire, what about the sacrifice? And Abraham says, don't worry, God will provide himself a sacrifice. Now, your version probably says God will provide for himself a sacrifice. But the issue here is the word basically says God will provide himself a sacrifice. Now, the issue, he says he's going to provide a lamb. Did God provide a lamb in Genesis 22? What did he provide? A ram. He didn't provide a lamb for the sacrifice. He provided a ram. But it's interesting. The mountain they're on is Mount Moriah. And as we study scriptures, we study history, later on in life, David is going to be bringing the ark back to Jerusalem. As he's bringing it back, there's all kinds of issues, so he leaves it at this guy's house. And he finally decides, I'm going to go to the guy's house, get the ark, and bring it back. And he offers to a sacrifice. And the guy says, well, here, I'll give you everything free. He says, no, I'll not offer to God anything that doesn't cost me. And where he's offering that sacrifice is a place called Mount Moriah. Then when the time comes for Solomon to build his temple, where does he build his temple? Mount Moriah. And where's Solomon's temple? It's in Jerusalem. And where is the lamb provided? In Jerusalem. Remember, John the Baptist says, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Now, Abraham didn't understand everything he was saying there. But he was trusting that God was going to provide what was needed. Because he feared God. So Isaac is seeing all this. Now, what do we learn about the fear of the Lord? Proverbs 9 says this. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Isaac saw the fear of his father and he understood. So what does this teach us about Isaac? Well, in Genesis 31, Jacob makes a kind of a weird statement twice. He says, it's the God of my father and the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac. He refers to God as the fear of Isaac. Now, this is the only place in Scripture that God is referred to as the fear of someone. And so what is it about Isaac that Jacob sees the fear of God? What is it about his life? So let's kind of look at his life story here for a minute. Isaac is the child of promise. It's promised in Genesis 12, 15, 17, and 18. That there's going to be this child, this heir of Abraham who's going to bring the nation to fruition and bless the nations through him. We know that Abraham cheated and took a concubine and had a child and said, well, let's just, through this child, the blessing will happen. And God said, no, that's not what I said. But then a year before Isaac's born, Brian talked about this story last week. The three angels, one of which being the angel of the Lord, come to Abraham. They're talking about what they're going to do with Sodom and Gomorrah. But in the midst of that, they tell Abraham, this time next year, Sarah is going to have a baby. And what does it say? It says Abraham laughed. It says Sarah overheard it and she laughed. You say, why was it so funny? Because he was 99 years old and she was 98. I don't know about you, and I don't know how much you know about biology, but 99 and 98, you don't have babies a whole lot. It's pretty much done by then. For those of us who are in our 50s, we're praising the Lord for that. You know, I love my grandkids, but they're my grandkids. I can send them home. But the issue here is they laugh. And it's not even so much that they laugh. They name the child Isaac, which means laughter. So everywhere Isaac goes, all of his buddies, everybody talks to him. When they call his name, it's just a reminder. We're laughing at you. You're funny. Look at your parents, for Pete's sake. This is hilarious. That's sure that's not your great-great-granddad there? No, that's my dad. I can remember picking Adam up from 8th grade. And you know, in my 30s, my hair was already white. And picking Adam up in 8th grade, and his buddies go, hey, your granddad's here to get you, you know. Now, I didn't laugh. I wanted to strangle the little kid. But you go, no, okay, so granddad's here to pick you up. Well, think about it. I mean, I was only then in my 30s. But here he is, he's this child of laughter. And then in 22 of Genesis, he's offered to God. And then in 24, he's married. And when he's 75, Abraham dies. And all these different things happen in Isaac's life. And we don't learn a whole lot about Isaac. But there's two events in Isaac's life that are key for us to understand. One is his birth. He's the child of promise. God has brought him to this relationship because that's who God has chosen to use to bring about his promise. The second thing is his marriage. Because it was important that Isaac carry on the lineage. So he's married and God blesses him with twins later on. And so we see that God's still working in Isaac and he's beginning to understand. Now, most of the time we tell the story of Isaac, we know that Isaac favored Esau over Jacob and Rebekah favored Jacob over Esau. And so there was all this tension in the family, and all this stuff. And we can get into all kinds of parenting issues on all that. But the point in all of it is, in the midst of even that, and again, warts and all, Isaac still was known, his God was known as the fear of Isaac. So what is it in Jacob's life, even though he wasn't Isaac's favorite and didn't hang out with Isaac a whole lot, doesn't seem like, he recognized something in Isaac's life that said Isaac feared God. Well, what did he recognize? As we think through that, we're going back to 1 Corinthians 10, but one thing he recognized is Isaac was humble. He said, well, how do we know Isaac was humble? Well, think about this for a minute. What are two things Isaac knows about his life? He knows that every time someone calls his name, they're calling him laughter, but why does he have that name? Because beyond all reason, he was born to an old couple. He was the child of promise. He sees later in life as his stepbrother is making fun of him, God tells Abraham, it's okay, go ahead and send Hagar and Ishmael. So that now he still recognizes, hey, I'm something. I'm Isaac. But then in the midst of thinking I'm something, he's walking up a mountain with his dad thinking, uh-oh. I'm something, but I'm expendable. And that's a good balance for us to remember. That God doesn't have to use any of us. It's only by His grace and by His new mercies every day that we're used by Him, that we are chosen by Him. But we're all expendable. Read the book of Ecclesiastes. It says you work all your life and you die, and what happens? Somebody takes your job and they move on. You retire, they hire somebody new, they forget all about you. It's depressing, isn't it? But he's saying we recognize and understand what God has done for us, and we have that joy. We understand, as Paul says in Corinthians, but we don't get too cocky. We know where we stand, but we also understand and know that God cares for us. and that we're expendable. So that brought humility to Isaac. We see that Isaac trusted God. Again, we talked about Genesis 12, Genesis 15, Genesis 17, Genesis 18, and then again in Genesis 26, God reiterates it to Isaac that you are the child of promise, that I have a plan, that through you and through your family, I'm going to make a great nation, and through that great nation, I'm going to bless the earth. I'm going to bless all the other nations. And so he understands, he trusts God in this. He trusted God even in the midst, because let's think about it. A teenager with a 112, 113-year-old father who's walking him up a mountain to sacrifice him, did he have to go? I think he'd probably take Dad out. I think he'd probably say, hey, I ain't going. If nothing else, he could probably outrun him. But he willfully chose. Because even though Abraham understood and trusted that Isaac would return, Isaac trusted it too. Because he trusted his dad, and he trusted his dad's God because of the fear of Isaac. The fear of God that Isaac had. He was trusting that it didn't look like things were going to happen the way he wanted them to, but he trusted that God was in control. You ever been in one of those situations where you know God has told you to do something and it seems crazy? And it seems like in the midst of it, God's kind of forgotten that he told you to do it. You know, are you sure, God? Yeah, I started right in the middle. You told me. But it's when we go, you know what? I don't understand everything. It doesn't look promising right now. But God has said to do this, and I'm going to do it. I'm going to hang in there. I'm going to stick in there because I fear God, and I trust him, and I know that he's not going to lie to me. And Isaac trusted God. We also know that Isaac was peaceful. Now, this does not mean that Isaac sat around in the lotus position and held his fingers out and did alms and yoga all the time. Doesn't mean he was peaceful in his mind. It means he was a man of peace. In Genesis 26, I'll turn there and read it for you. Genesis 26, it says this. When Abimelech went to him from Gerar with Ahuzeth, his advisor, and Phicol, the commander of his army. And let me just a real quick note here. If you're ever reading the Old Testament, just read the names real fast. Nobody knows whether you're saying them right or not. Just keep moving. Isaac said to them, why have you come to me, seeing that you hate me and have sent me away from you? And they said, we see plainly that the Lord has been with you. So we said, let there be a sworn pact between you and us. Let us make a covenant with you that you will do us no harm, just as we have not touched you, have done you nothing but good, and have sent you away in peace. You are blessed of the Lord. So he made them a feast, and they ate and drank. In the morning they rose early and exchanged oath. Isaac sent them on their way, and they departed from him in peace. These people had abused Isaac. They had treated his servants terribly. And when they came to him and said, hey, we're sorry. We want to make peace. He made peace. Paul says in Romans, as far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Now, Paul's recognizing there that there's going to be times when you try to be at peace and the other person just does not want it. And they refuse to be at peace. But as far as it depends on you, if you fear God and you trust him and you're humble, you recognize and understand the importance of reconciliation with others. The importance of those relationships. The importance of being a person of peace that can restore those relationships. And then we also see with Isaac that he was prayerful. In chapter 25, we're told something about Isaac and his wife. That was told about Abraham and his wife. We'll see it's also told about Jacob and his wife. Is that Isaac's wife was barren. Now, Isaac has been told, just like Abraham was told, through you, I'm going to build a great nation. Through your family, I'm going to bless the world. And his wife can't have children. Seems like God's kind of blowing it. And in the midst of where things didn't look promising, he prayed. It says he prayed that God would open his wife's womb. And God gave him twins. God listened to his prayer. Now, I don't know how long Isaac prayed for his wife, but I do know that he married her when he was 40. And she had Jacob and Esau when she was 60. So it's possible that for 20 years, he's praying, God, open her womb. And God provides. God takes care of the need. He's a prayerful person. Therefore, we hear that if God, the God of my father, the God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac. So Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. He feared God. Therefore, because he feared God, he had wisdom. You know, I remember as a kid, this was a very juvenile prayer to pray. I grew up in the church. I was probably maybe 10 or 11 when my mom and dad gave me a living Bible. Do you remember the big green thick thing? And for some reason, that was one I could read as a kid, and so I started reading. And I can remember reading the story of Solomon when he was called to be the king. And God says, whatever you want. And Solomon says, give me wisdom, because I don't know how to lead these people. Now, in no way as a kid did I think I was ever going to lead a nation. But I can remember as a kid praying, God, give me wisdom. I didn't have any idea what that meant. But I remember praying that as a kid. And I can remember later in life reading James 1:5 that if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men generously and without reproach. And I said, God, give me wisdom. But you know what wisdom is not? Wisdom is not knowledge. We equate those two, but they're not the same. There are a lot of people who have a lot of knowledge who are dumb as stumps. And there are a lot of people who are wise who have a 6th grade education. The issue is not knowledge. The issue is a changed lifestyle. The issue is when I walk in wisdom, I'm walking to honor the Lord. When James says in James 1:5, we quote that passage. I quote it a lot. But it's in the midst of trials and tribulations. Consider it all joy when you encounter various trials. In the midst of those trials, you ask for wisdom. And God gives it generously. James 3:17 describes godly wisdom. It says this, the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. Nothing in that is about how smart someone is. It's godly wisdom that results in purity, in peace, in gentleness, in mercy and good fruits, in being impartial and sincere. It means reflecting who Christ is to the world. Not how much you know. Colossians 1:9, Paul prays this for the Colossians. He says this, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of His will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding. Now, sounds good. Paul's praying for spiritual wisdom and knowledge for the Colossians. What does he say in verse 10? So that you will walk worthy. Doesn't say I'm asking for you to have a bunch of knowledge. He said I'm asking for spiritual wisdom so that you will walk worthy. So what should we do? Well, James 1:5 tells us what to do. If we don't have wisdom, we're to ask. Ask God for wisdom. Now, remember what we said where James 1:5 falls. It's not ask God for wisdom and sit back and just wait for this flood. All this wisdom is going to pour out on me tomorrow. Wisdom comes in trusting the Lord and walking with the Lord in the midst of everything that comes our way, good and bad. It's understanding and knowing who He is. It's getting to see beyond. You know where David quoted earlier, Jehovah Jireh. You know where that comes from? Genesis 22:8. God provides. God will provide Himself the lamb. Jehovah Jireh. You know where we get a word we use in English quite a bit from this idea of God providing? It's the word providence. The providence of God. It's not just that God's sitting up there and He knows everything. It's that He is providing. He is taking care. He's doing whatever it takes to make us like Christ. And so in Romans 8, that all these good things that come, they come because they're developing us and making us more like Christ, making us into His image. So we ask for wisdom, not so that we can impress everybody with our knowledge, but we ask for wisdom so that we may walk worthy. And then not only do we ask for wisdom, we're to show wisdom. In James 3, he says this in verse 13. We had verse 17 up on the screen, but he says this in verse 13. Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast, be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere, and a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. He says there's a difference. What the world sees as wisdom is a bunch of knowledge that makes me talk about how proud and wonderful and smart I am and how stupid you are. And it breeds jealousy and dissension. Paul says, knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. So it's not wisdom being smarter. It's showing our wisdom, he says here, by our works, by our good works. James over and over again in the book says, you say you believe, but show it by your works. You're saying this is true, but show it by your works. And then he says in chapter 4, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning, your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and He will exalt you. Humble yourselves. Humility before the Lord. You're trusting Him. He will bring peace into your life. You'll be a person of prayer. Are you going to be perfect? Well, Isaac wasn't. James wasn't. Paul wasn't. Don't expect perfection. But do expect when you're walking in wisdom, you're seeking to be all that God has called you to be. And when there is an imperfection, you stop, like we talked about a couple weeks ago, you hold short accounts with God. You stop right then, you confess it, and you move on. Because my prayer for you is the same as Paul's prayer for the people of Colossae. That you have wisdom and all spiritual knowledge and understanding so that you walk worthy of the calling with which you've been called. Let's ask. Let's show the wisdom of the Lord in our lives. Let's pray.